Hey guys, Lawrence DeMonico, president of Rare Breed Triggers. The reason for this video today is that I'd like to bring everyone up to speed on our most recent hearings in our litigation against the DOJ in the Eastern District of New York. It's been quite some time since I put out a video explaining the details of our case, so before I get into it, I'd like to go over some of the background information in order to ensure we're all on the same sheet of music. When Congress created the definition of a machine gun in 1934, they specifically chose to use the phrase single function of the trigger. Congress could have used the phrase single pull of the trigger as they had previously done in the definitions of rifle and shotgun, but they did not. And federal law tells us that when Congress uses one term in a statute and another term in the same statute, we should accept that it was done intentionally. And Congress was aware that in 1934 there were machine guns like the Vickers and others where you pushed the trigger paddle, you didn't pull it. So they wanted to say each time the trigger operates, whether pushed or pulled, and chose the phrase function of the trigger. So with that understanding, Rare Breed Triggers set out on a mission to use the technology that would allow the shooter to fire extremely fast, but also would not fall within the statutory requirements to be classified as a machine gun per federal law. So to be very, very clear, the FRT-15 was intentionally designed and manufactured to only fire one round per single function of the trigger. After 84 years of using the definition as it was written in the National Firearms Act of 1934, the ATF set out to reinterpret or actually expand the definition of machine gun through a rulemaking process in 2018. Rather than sticking with the phrase single function of the trigger, they wanted to expand it to single pull of the trigger in analogous motions. This change has been referred to as the bump stock rule because that was the focus on what they intended to expand the law to cover. This ATF rule has been litigated numerous times over recent years, and there is currently a split between the circuits. Let me explain. A U.S. military court found the rule to be unconstitutional. The D.C. Circuit found the rule to be acceptable, but made that decision based on deference rather than on the merits of the case. The issue is still being litigated in the 10th Circuit, with both sides having recently filed motions for summary judgment, which means a decision from the court is likely forthcoming sometime in the near future. That brings us to the 5th Circuit, which ruled earlier this year in Cargill v. Garland that the rule was a violation of the APA, or the Administrative Procedures Act, and further stated that the ATF did not have the authority to create such a rule. The court then went on to explain that the definition of a machine gun as written by Congress turns on the action of the trigger, not the action of the shooter. They went further to clearly explain what single function of the trigger means in the statutory definition of machine gun. This was the first civil court, meaning from the district court level through the full 5th Circuit Court of Appeals, to actually make a ruling on the merits of the case. A few months later, the 6th Circuit issued a very similar ruling on the merits in Hardin v. ATF, agreeing with the 5th Circuit's decision and analysis of the phrase single function of the trigger. Both the 5th and 6th Circuits also cited the rule of lenity, saying that since the ATF has flip-flopped on the interpretation of the statute, they have made it ambiguous. The rule of lenity means the court must use the interpretation that is most beneficial for the defendants if the statute is ambiguous. The 5th Circuit's decision in Cargill has now been sent to the Supreme Court, with both sides having requested cert, which means both sides have requested the Supreme Court accept the case. The ATF put in a tremendous amount of time and effort to put forth this rule, and in doing so, they came to the conclusion and intentionally decided to use the phrase single pull of the trigger in analogous motions. That was their best interpretation of the statutory definition, well, at least for the moment, or until they decided to change their position again. So when the ATF made a decision to move against Rare Breed, they made numerous accusations claiming that the FRT-15 met the definition of a machine gun because it fired more than one round by a single function of the trigger, a single pull/function of the trigger, and even a single continuous pull/function of the trigger. Now, they used this language to pull us into court and even obtain an ex parte temporary restraining order, preventing us from doing business, effectively shutting us down. Now, ex parte means that the hearing they had with the court was in secret, and we didn't get to present an argument or our side of the story. Regardless, when we finally had our first day in court a couple weeks ago, which was a preliminary injunction hearing, they decided to move away from this single continuous pull of the trigger language and have now made the decision to use the phrase constant rearward pressure. And I take issue with this new language for numerous reasons. One, I'm not sure they would have been able to pull us into court at all had they used that language to begin with. Two, constant rearward pressure is not at all synonymous with the phrase single function of the trigger. Three, using this new language completely changes the definition as constant rearward pressure turns on input of the shooter rather than turning on the mechanical function of the trigger. Four, if the phrase constant rearward pressure is accepted by the court, that phrase could then be used to reclassify every semi-automatic trigger in the world a machine gun. Let me explain. As any shooter worth their salt would know, the shooter is not required to break constant rearward pressure from the trigger when firing a string of shots. The shooter places his finger on the trigger, takes up the slack by using rearward pressure, fires a shot by using rearward pressure, allows the trigger to reset by reducing the amount of rearward pressure, and then continues to fire again by repeating those steps. The point being, at no point when firing a semi-automatic trigger is a shooter ever required to break his constant rearward pressure. The shooter is only required to vary the amount of constant rearward pressure applied to the trigger. And last, 5. As I previously explained, the ATF just went through a very long rulemaking process where they intentionally and carefully chose the phrase single pull/function and analogous motions, and have repeatedly claimed that new phrase was their best interpretation of the statutory definition of machine gun, a statute that has been on the books for nearly 90 years. Why is it now that they've decided to use the phrase constant rearward pressure? They could have chosen to use that phrase in their rulemaking process. The leap from single function of the trigger to single pull of the trigger is already quite the leap. But single function of the trigger to constant rearward pressure is wildly ridiculous. The ATF's expert made numerous attempts to confuse the court by misstating the facts and overcomplicating issues that are truly very simple. For example, he stated that the locking bar of an FRT-15 and the auto sear of a machine gun serve the same function, which is to capture a fire control component. Well, that isn't untrue, but it seems more like an intentional attempt to mislead the court. And why do I say this? Well, the function of the locking bar in an FRT-15 is to lock and unlock the trigger. The function of an auto sear is to release the hammer. Of course, both the trigger and hammer are both fire control components, but they are different parts and they perform different functions. So rather than simply explaining how these parts differ, the government's expert attempted to equate releasing the hammer with the unlocking of the trigger. Of course, when an auto sear releases the hammer, it allows for automatic fire. When the locking bar disengages from and unlocks the trigger, it creates an opportunity for an external force, i.e. the shooter, to pull the trigger, in turn causing it to function and fire another round. In reality, they are really quite different. Eventually in our hearing, the ATF conceded 3 very significant points about the FRT-15. 1, the trigger functions for every round that is fired. 2, the trigger is pulled and moves to the rear for every round fired. And 3, the trigger resets between every round that is fired. Now, this sounds like an admission that we've been right all along, but now the ATF says that they've been using this phrase, constant rearward pressure, to secretly classify items since 1975. Now, let that sink in for a second. The DOJ has asked the judge in New York to shut down our business and seize all of our assets based on a phrase that doesn't exist in the statutory definition of machine gun. I'm not even sure where to start with that, but I feel very confident stating that the ATF using secret rules to stifle innovation and unconstitutionally infringe on the Second Amendment should not be tolerated. Okay, so we just went back to court this week in New York to present our closing arguments, and we expect to have a decision from the court within the next few weeks on whether or not we'll be able to stay in business throughout the remainder of this litigation. Now, with all of that said, I also want to address a topic that I've seen come up quite a bit. People want to know if we have turned over our customer list. I've said this time and time again, but I will go ahead and say it again for the record. We have not turned over any customer list. This can be verified by anyone at all by reading through the pleadings, which are publicly available. As I've stated in the past, according to Rare Breed's customer data privacy policy, which we refer to as a digital shredding policy, once the customer's personal information is no longer needed, our system automatically anonymizes that info. So specifically, once we no longer need the customer's info, their name, address, email address, and phone number are anonymized. So simply put, it no longer exists within our system. So with that said, I feel like it is absolutely crucial for me to be completely transparent and forthcoming on this issue. Through discovery in this litigation in the Eastern District of New York, we have learned that the ATF was able to obtain our shipping records from the United States Postal Service. Now, let me explain why this is such a big deal. We weren't notified, they didn't serve them with a subpoena, and they didn't even have to get a warrant. They simply approached a postmaster and asked for the records. Now, it's also important to note that we didn't start using the United States Postal Service until we started selling Watts, which was in late 2022. So what the ATF has is a list of people that received a package from us in late 2022. That's it. So let me be clear. The government obtained that list from the USPS, not us. Now let's talk about UPS. Early in this litigation, the DOJ served a third-party subpoena on UPS to obtain our shipping records from them. I'll spare you the voluminous details on the back and forth of things, but I will go ahead and tell you where we currently stand. By way of this third-party subpoena, the DOJ was able to obtain the shipping records from UPS, but we've put up one hell of a fight to keep those records private, and as of now, in the foreseeable future, those records are sealed by a protective order from the court, preventing the DOJ from sharing them with the ATF. Now, let me say that again. As of now, those records are sealed by a protective order from the court, preventing the DOJ from sharing them with the ATF. But with that said, you can rest assured that the DOJ is itching to give that list to the ATF so they can continue their draconian confiscation efforts. All right, so this brings everyone up to speed on the current happenings in our New York litigation. Now, I'd like to talk about the forced reset trigger lawsuit just recently filed in Texas by the National Association for Gun Rights. I want to explain why it is so important and why it should matter to you. The lawsuit is National Association for Gun Rights v. Garland, which was just filed in federal court in the Northern District of Texas. This is the exact same judicial circuit that ruled earlier this year that bump stocks are not machine guns in Cargill v. Garland, the same district that ruled 80% receivers are not firearms, and the same district that enjoined the ATF from enforcing its ban on arm braces. That means all we should have to do is ask the district court to follow Cargill, which says that the ATF doesn't get to invent laws that says bump stocks or forced reset triggers, as this case may be, are illegal when Congress hasn't said that. This lawsuit simply asks the court to apply the same reasoning to our forced reset triggers. And that's why we're confident that we're going to win, but you and I both know the DOJ and ATF are going to put up one hell of a fight. So here it is. Here's the call to action. We need your help. There is a link in the description of this video, and also there is a pinned comment below. We need you to join in the fight by contributing to the lawsuit fund. The best lawyers are expensive, and we're going up against a rogue executive agency defended by a team of DOJ attorneys. There's another point I'd like to bring up, and if there's only one point you take away from this video, let it be this one. When you click the link and make a donation, part of that donation will be used to cover your membership to NAGR. Now, let me explain why that is such a big deal. One of the first moves made by NAGR in this litigation was to file for a preliminary injunction to prevent the DOJ and ATF from initiating or pursuing civil or criminal actions against the plaintiffs in this case. And here's the most important takeaway. NAGR is suing on behalf of its members and is seeking a preliminary injunction. So each and every member of NAGR should be covered by an injunction should one be granted by the court. So what does that actually mean? It means that if you become a member of NAGR and an injunction is issued by the court, you would then have protection against civil and or criminal prosecution until a final decision is made by the court. And just so you're all aware, this isn't unlikely at all, as we've recently seen similar injunctive relief granted to another group's members in a pistol brace case. Now, I need to be very clear, this is not a promise, but it is highly probable. If injunctive relief is granted, great. But if not, you can rest assured that your donation will be used to support the continued fight all the way to the end. Thanks for listening, and most of all, thank you for your help. Every donation, even small ones, will help in the fight. Please be sure to share this video with anyone and everyone you know that owns or would like to own a forced reset trigger and might want to help. Thank you.